Okay, everyone, welcome to today's show. Joining me today is Mike Williams, the host of Sage of Quay Radio Hour and a true pioneer in the world of alternative research and critical thinking. Mike is known for his deep dives into esoteric topics, social engineering, and the hidden forces shaping our reality, from exploring the Paul is dead theory to exposing the Tavistock Institute's influence on music and culture. His work challenges mainstream narratives and invites us to question what we think we know. Mike, welcome to the show, my friend.
John, thank you for asking me to join your show.
Yeah, no, I'm really looking forward to this, mate. I have been for weeks now. I mean, the Beatles is such an interesting topic. Even just posted up in my community page, just saying I was going to have you on, and it just created this, opened a Pandora's box of comments. You know, arguments were going off about, oh no, it's just a bit of artistic impression. It's not really anything occult, and there's all this, and then there were backwards and forwards, and that was just in the comments. So it's a huge subject, isn't it, Mike? And like, how did you even get interested in it in the first place?
Well, I was a huge Beatle freak, John, going back to when I was a kid, and I've told this story a number of times. I remember very clearly in 1968, when I was 9 years old, bugging my parents to take me to go see Yellow Submarine. So even at 9 years old, and my brother's about 14 months younger than I am, and the two of us were really into the Beatles. So I was this little Beatle freak. Going into the 1970s, I knew about and heard about the rumor of Paul McCartney being replaced, or otherwise known as Paul is Dead. I just thought it was a clever marketing ploy because the Beatles have always been sold to us as four guys that are very clever and witty, and it was a way to engage with their fans. And in fact, the whole rumor did tick up record sales when it came out. And so I was one of these people that heard the rumor, and I always thought that Paul has always been Paul, and it's just like I said, a marketing ploy that the Beatles put out there to engage with their fan base. And so it wasn't until 2016 that I came across a book titled The Memoirs of Billy Shears. And the book actually was published in September of 2009. And so 7 years later, I caught up with it, and I found it on Amazon. I read the synopsis, and I thought, okay, I'll give this a shot and see what this is about. So I read the book, and when I read it, there was a lot of information in that book, and I mean a lot of information that contradicted the official narrative. It was a bit mind-blowing. So at that point, I could have done two things. One, I could have just set the book aside and continued to believe what I believed about the Beatles, or I can take a look at the claims that the book was making about Paul McCartney and the Beatles and see if I can either debunk what was being said in the book or confirm what we were being told. So I embarked on that process. But it's interesting, I embarked on that process only really after I did my first show on the topic, which was back in, it was September of 2016 with Sophia Smallstorm. And I had told Sophia about the book months earlier because I was reading it. The book is 666 pages, 66 chapters. We can get into the occult a little bit, maybe later on in the show, which the Beatles as an entity were immersed in. And I was telling her about the book, and she was saying to me, hey, it's very interesting. Why don't you come on my podcast and talk about it? And I was pushing back because I thought to myself, how am I going to boil down 666 pages of information and be able to talk about that on a 2-hour podcast? And I just knew it was going to be an enormous amount of work, because to do that, you have to go through the book, you have to break it down, you have to categorize the topics, you have to put it into a storyline in order to be able to present it. So I thought maybe she would forget about it, and she didn't forget about it, and she kept pressing me to come on the show to talk about the book and what the book was telling us. So finally I relented. I said, okay. So I did the work, and I put together this huge PowerPoint presentation as an outline to take me through this discussion with Sophia so that it made sense. I thought that was going to be it, John. I thought that was going to be the first and last presentation I was ever going to do on this topic. And then a little after that, Mark Devlin reached out to me. Mark said, hey, Mike, would you come on my show to talk about it? And I said, okay, so I'll do the show with Mark. Famous last words, too. I think it was toward the latter part of that interview, I said to Mark, this was going to be the last discussion or the last interview I was going to do on Paul is Dead, because I want to move on. I didn't want to become the Paul is Dead guy. I looked at it as kind of painting yourself in a corner. But what happened was, John, whole topic is far, far more complex and far more involved than just the replacement of Paul McCartney. As I continued to do the research, even though I said I didn't want to do it anymore because I was curious. That's what the motivation was. I was just curious. You find one bit of information and then you say, okay, well, that's interesting. Well, let me go a little further. Then you go a little further, then you find more information. And before you know it, you have all these rabbit holes that you've jumped into, and you're trying to figure out what's true, what's not true. And so I did it for 8 years, and I retired the ongoing day in and day out research back in November of this past year, November 9th of 2024. I picked that date. Some people think it was occulted. It wasn't. The reason why I picked November 9th was because that's the day that Brian Epstein tells us that he met the Beatles at the Cavern in 1961. Some people just read way too much.
Yeah, it's every little detail. Yeah.
Every little thing, right? Just having some fun.
Yeah, yeah.
After 8 years, I got very, very, very involved in it. Probably what I'll be most known for is the work where I took a dive into their music and whether they wrote all their music and whether they played on all of their recorded tracks. And I put that presentation out back in April of 2020. It's titled, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music? And it's 4.5 hours long. And I had 2 follow-ups to that presentation, one I think in 2023 and another one in the early part of 2024. I concluded that they did not write all their own music and that they did not play on all of their recorded tracks. And in fact, that the Beatles were a creation of the Tavistock Institute with linkages going back to the Frankfurt School. For those of you who are not familiar with the Frankfurt School, initially out of Germany, and their ideology was, and still is to this day, cultural Marxism, the implementation of Marxism. So the Beatles were put into play as a gigantic social engineering initiative, and they were really the first created band with the mission to social engineer at a worldwide level. And their job was to set the agenda forward for the New World Order, the One World Order, whatever you want to call them, the control system, to break down traditional family values, to break down traditional religions. In particular, they had a target on Christianity. And what ensued after the Beatles, because the Beatles, John, became a template for all the bands that followed. So Tavistock created the Beatles, Tavistock created the Rolling Stones. The entire British invasion came out of the Tavistock Institute. And for those who are not familiar with Tavistock, they're out of London. They've been in existence now for 100 years. They initially began as the propaganda arm for the British military going back to World War I, known as Wellington House. And then, and I think it was 1921, and that was about the same time that the Frankfurt School came together out of Germany. They became the Tavistock Clinic, and they said that their mission was to take a look at and to evaluate and see if they could help soldiers from World War I who were suffering from what they referred to back in the day as shell shock. Really what it was, what they were doing was they were working with these subjects to better understand human psychology and trauma. But they weren't necessarily doing it to help them. They were doing it so that they can further understand how to engage mass mind control, manipulation through psychological means, social engineering. So, Tavistock was really staffed with social scientists. And like I said, at the same time in the 1920s, that's when the Frankfurt School came together. And the thing we have to understand is all of these internationalist organizations, they're all connected together. They're all intertwined. You can't look at them as if they're in their own silos. It's not a vertical structure. It's a horizontal structure with verticals connected. In Tavistock, what they did was once they got through World War I, they set their sights. See, World War I and their psychological operation and their mind control and mass manipulation of the psyche in Europe, that was the World War I piece of work that they did. And then once we got into World War II, they set their sights on the United States. Edward Bernays was one of their social scientists, one of their people that came to the United States and had the responsibility to get these psychological programs implemented here. Because if they couldn't change what America was about, America had to fall in order for the New World Order, One World Order, again, however you want to label it, to proceed with their agenda and be successful. So the Beatles are a product of that, as is most of the psychological operations to manipulate people, to change morals, ethics, belief systems, to alter lifestyles. And a lot of it is done through gaslighting, basically telling you or telling the people what they wanted to hear and then doing the exact opposite behind the scenes.
Can you give an example of that?
They had to break down the family nucleus. When I say they, I'm talking about the controllers, Tavistock, the Frankfurt School, the Club of Rome, the Bilderbergs, Davos, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission. Like I said, they're all tied together. They could not have traditional values in the way, because when people stuck to their ancestral values and traditions, that was their world. And that's how they defined their family values. That's how they brought their children up and so on. So they knew they had to break that down. To attack it, they had to break up the family from a traditional perspective. So they had to get the mother out of the house. So what they did was they said, hey, why do you stay home? Well, I stay home in order to care for the children and care for the home. Do you really want to do that? Why do you do that? Well, that's what a woman's, quote, role is. Well, that's some role that somebody gave you. That's some role that was fed to you that you believed. Why is it that you can't go out to work as well and go do what your husband's doing? Again, a lot of women were very satisfied and very happy with the traditional role. And there's going to be people listening to this right now that I know, because I've been at this for a long time, that are saying, well, the traditional roles are old-fashioned. Well, old-fashioned doesn't mean bad. It doesn't mean wrong. So if you're thinking that way, I would argue that you have been conditioned to lean that way, when in fact, we have to have defined roles in order to keep the family traditional values and the family nucleus together. Once you break it up and once you scatter it, it's a free-for-all.
Yeah.
So they got the woman out of the house. She went to work. And so what's happened to the children? Well, the children get taken to daycare. The children get taken to preschool. Then they go to school, which are really indoctrination centers. And maybe they have to go someplace after school because the parents aren't home yet. And so the influences for the child are not the parents Monday through Friday. It's an outside influence by caretakers. And in essence, we can almost say that they've become wards of the state. And the parents, when did the parents have the children? Well, they'll have them on the weekends. But with all the hectic schedules of mom and dad working Monday through Friday, once you get to Saturday and Sunday, they're running around trying to get things done, to tidy things up around the house, to go shopping, to do this, do that. So again, even then, the time is very limited with the children. And then what they did was, in order to ensure that they were able to get both parents out of the house and work, they started to do things economically and financially to make it virtually impossible to be able to live on one income and raise your family. So they forced a situation where financially both parents had to go to work because they couldn't afford to live on one salary. So they have a lot of levers that they push, a lot of buttons that they push. If this doesn't work, or it's not motivating you enough to do what we want you to do, then we're going to push the next lever down until we get to the point where we got you doing what we want you to be doing with your life. So this is the control piece of it. They're controlling people. And unfortunately, most people don't understand that they're being controlled because they've been in this system for so long that they just believe this is the way it works. This is just life. This is the way life is. Both parents go to work. There's daycare. There's after school. There's this, there's that. But the truth of the matter is it wasn't like that going back 40, 50, 60 years ago. And I wouldn't say that the change is a change for the good because we can see how society is breaking down. It's breaking down every single day. A lot of what goes on in the world today doesn't make any sense because it's all engineered to be operating the exact way it's operating to create as much chaos as possible so that they can bring in their order from chaos. And it's just a whole litany of this as we go through time. And I usually start with 1960, and I realize and I understand that a lot of it was going on before 1960. But 1960 with the counterculture, that's when they really put the pedal to the metal and they stepped on the gas. And they really, really got into creating societal and cultural change. And music is a huge, huge piece of that. Hollywood, the entertainment industry, and attached at the hip is the music industry. Music and film is very, very powerful. And this is something that the Tavistock Institute and the Frankfurt School in their white papers, published papers, talked about all the time, how they would easily be able to manipulate the masses through the media. And again, music is a part of that media.
Absolutely. Would you say the Beatles were the first of its kind to do that, or was that always going on even before them in the
It was
music
going
industry?
on before that, but the
Yeah,
Beatles were by far the biggest. So we could talk about Frank Sinatra.
yeah,
We could talk about Elvis Presley, the way he presented himself on stage. It was very provocative at the time. A word that I use to explain the process is disruptive. Disruption forces change. This is also a term that's used in the corporate world, disruptive technology. When corporations talk about, especially corporations that are in the technology business, talk about disruptive technology, they're talking about technology that's going to displace the current environment or the current landscape of technology that's out there. So you take that and you move it at a higher level up to the control system, like the Committee of 300, Tavistock, and some of the other organizations that I rattled off before, the Bilderbergs, the Trilaterals, Davos, Council on Foreign Relations, the Club of Rome, all of these organizations, this is what they do. They have to create disruption, because from disruption, they're going to be able to reshape the society, they'll reshape the culture, and they are looking to reshape it and mold it in their image, or what it is that their vision, their strategy is. And that's what we're seeing taking place every single day. So the Beatles, though, became the largest, by far, the most significant social engineering initiative that was based in music, pop music. And that's the other thing I should probably just expand upon, John, before we go any further. When I talk about how the controllers are looking to get traditional values and ancestral values off the table, to get people disconnected, they're replacing it with pop culture. So your traditional culture is being replaced with, or has been replaced with, pop culture. So what is pop culture? Pop culture is Netflix, it's ball games, it's beer, it's drugs. It's all of the stuff that we see today that people embrace and accept as their world. But the truth of the matter is, pop culture is not your world. Pop culture is something that you assimilated, that you embraced. But when you really take a step back and you think about, well, what is pop culture? What is it? What is it really? It's Taylor Swift
yeah.
and her cult known as the
Oh,
Swifties.
oh my God.
And Taylor Swift is just a latter day iteration of what went on with the Beatles. The Beatles were really the first boy band. That's why they called it Beatlemania. When you think about the word mania,
Yeah, manic.
getting people worked up, that's a mania,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, I hope that makes
Yeah,
sense.
no, that was great. And maybe you'll mention it as well, but did they start off organic, or were they
No.
immediately, were they from the get-go, or like engineered and utilized and harnessed?
Yeah, I mean, I get asked that question. So when I say no, I'm giving you my opinion based upon my research. There's going to be lots of people who are going to argue about this. That's fine.
Yeah.
Folks, after 8 years, I've heard every argument you could
Mm.
possibly throw at me. In fact, many of the arguments that people present to me are arguments that I used to present before I woke up to what the Beatles were all about. Let me start here. There are images on the internet of Paul McCartney and George Harrison with bird cages on their heads. There's also images of John Lennon in a Superman shirt leaning up against a bird cage. Birdcage symbolism is Illuminati symbolism for mind control. So the first question we've got to ask ourselves is, why are the Beatles engaged in this type of symbolism? So what the controllers do is they communicate out to their inner circle through this symbolism. They refer to you and me and everybody else, people who are listening to this, as the profane. We are not educated in the esoteric, in the occult, in their symbolism and all that stuff. So they communicate out. And so when I saw that symbolism, and I actually talked about it a little bit in my first presentation, more so afterwards, because I didn't want to bog the first presentation down with MK Ultra or Illuminati mind control. When I saw that symbolism, that said to me that it's possible they were in mind control programs, handled and groomed from an early age. How early? Could it be preteen? I don't know. But I think by the time they got to Hamburg, when they were in their late teens, I think John was around 20, they were in a program, whether they knew it or not. They were being handled and groomed by forces that were bringing them along. And I'll take the audience through the timeline. That's probably the best way to understand how it is that they weren't organic. The Beatles, they arrive in Hamburg in August of 1960. Now, when they arrive in Hamburg in August of 1960, they have very limited musical skills. They're not a very good band at all, mediocre at best. And this is not just me saying this. There's been lots of mainstream books that have been written on this to explain that they were not musical virtuosos. In fact, going into the 1980 Playboy interview, John Lennon said that none of them could read or write music. But going back to Hamburg, so you've got this ragtag group of guys, and Pete Best was the drummer at the time, and they're playing these clubs in Hamburg. And in fact, there's a documentary called The Complete Beatles, which was the Beatles documentary before Anthology was released in the 1990s. The Complete Beatles was released in the 1980s. In that documentary, their manager prior to Brian Epstein, Alan Williams, he was explaining that when he tried to get them into Hamburg, he was told, don't bring that bum group, the Beatles, to Germany. We've got a good thing going here. Don't bring those guys here. And in fact, there's a lot of information out there that paints a very clear picture that they were not great musicians and they weren't songwriters. And I'll take the audience through that in a little bit too, especially as it comes from their producer, George Martin. That's very, very telling. So in any case, what happens is they get to Germany, Hamburg, Germany in August of 1960, and they're there through December. They go home dejected because absolutely nothing transpired. They were doing what teenage guys do. They were drinking, popping pills, having lots of sex, and going on stage for a number of hours each night in these clubs, these dives that they were in. When they got back in December of 1960, after being in Germany for 4 months, like I said, it didn't go well. It was nothing that clicked for them. And in fact, in the book, Lennon Prophecy, the author is Joseph Niezgoda. He explains very clearly that their first stint in Hamburg was a failure. Then all of a sudden, they start getting all of these gigs starting in January of 1961. We have to start asking ourselves now, well, how are they getting all these gigs? They're not a very good band. They're not writing original music. They were a cover band. They were a bar and club band right up through 1962 when they met George Martin. And in fact, maybe what I can do here is if I could bring up one chart.
Just have a quick question then. If they were socially engineered from the get-go, why did they choose a bunch of guys who couldn't play well?
Because they didn't need songwriters. Tavistock and EMI had their songwriters. They didn't need them to be in the studio to record the music because they had their studio musicians. What they needed was performers. They needed a veneer. And when I take you through some charts later on, what you'll hear from George Martin, he said they had great charisma.
Yeah.
And George Martin says this a number of times in different interviews. They had charisma. So basically, it was like the Monkees. It was picking 4 characters to play a part in a theater production starring these 4 guys. And I'll take everybody through about the music and all this stuff because I'm sure a lot of people right now are losing their minds. And the reason why you're losing your minds is because it has been pounded into our heads for 60 years about the myth of the Beatles. In fact, in a 1970 or 71, I think it was, interview that John Lennon did with Rolling Stone magazine, John referred to Paul McCartney as a myth, the Beatles as a myth, and Bob Dylan as a myth. So, and I'll take everybody through this stuff because I know it's difficult. If you're a Beatle fan and you're listening to this is a hard pill to swallow, and it was a hard pill for me to swallow as well. But we have to come to grips with the fact that this world is controlled, cradle to grave. Anything worth knowing is a lie. And everything is a production, everything is a narrative in order to maintain that control. Probably a lot of people right now are thinking, well, the music industry is a dark place. There's a lot of really, really dark, bad stuff that goes on there. They'll look at the current batch of artists and entertainers and performers and say they're controlled, they're this, they're that. But they won't ever go back and say that the Beatles were controlled and handled and groomed, or the Rolling Stones. They won't take that leap. And you have to understand that there's big money there. You have to understand that these record companies are there to make money. The labels are there to make money. and what goes on behind the scenes to present that product, most people are unaware of. I recommend 3 documentaries. Watch The Wrecking Crew. It's on YouTube. The Wrecking Crew was a group of studio musicians located in Los Angeles, and they were on most of the pop music in the 1960s and 1970s. When you hear the recordings of many of these groups that you were listening to, people who are my age back in the 60s and 70s, you're listening to The Wrecking Crew. Another very similar approach was done at Muscle Shoals Studio on the East Coast. They were doing the same thing with their studio musicians. And also watch the documentary Hired Gun. So Hired Gun really explains how many of these studio musicians, they actually joined bands in the 1980s. So they went from just being in the studio to actually being in bands. Anyway, so let's take a look at this this chart. Okay, can you see that, John?
Yeah, I can now. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I put this chart together to explain the Beatles' 1960 through 1963 timeline. So let me just take you through it. I have the chart numbered, and I'll step through it as quickly as I can, but slow enough so that it makes sense. So I just talked about the documentary from the 1980s, The Complete Beatles, which was considered the documentary on the Beatles until Anthology was released in the 1990s. And in that documentary, it tells us that John Lennon and Paul McCartney, whether individually or together, allegedly wrote 100 songs between them from 1956 through 1962. 100 songs between 1956 and 1962. So just keep that in mind because that's going to come into play in a little bit. In 1960, as I mentioned, in August of 1960, that's when the Beatles first arrive in Hamburg. And when they arrive, John Lennon is 20 years old, Paul is 18, George is 17, and again, Pete Best is their drummer. They were young, they were inexperienced, and they were rough around the edges. They were a bar and club band, and not a very good one at that. So what was Hamburg? So let's just pause for a second. Hamburg was boot camp. Remember, you asked the question, why these 4 guys? And I said, well, because they needed their performers. They needed a veneer for the psychological operation known as the Beatles. And so Hamburg was boot camp. Hamburg was playing 7 hours a night for weeks at a time to build their playing chops so that they would get to a point where they were adequate or competent enough on their instruments where when Tavistock was ready to throw the switch on Beatlemania, they would send them out to go do their live gigs, and they would be able to perform the songs that they were taught. So the songs that the Beatles were playing live between 62 and through 1966, they were taught these songs. They didn't write these songs, they were taught these songs. In fact, I did an analysis. It was a real quick down and dirty. I took a look at the number of songs that the Beatles had recorded, had under their belt at a certain point in time, like 63, 64, 65, 66, and how many of the original songs up to that point did they actually perform live? And it was around 25%. So about 25% of the songs that they were credited with writing on their albums and their singles were played live. We have to ask ourselves, what happened to the other 75% of the songs? And what we find during their concerts is there's a repetition where they tended to play the same songs over and over. In fact, in a 1966 concert, they were going back to songs from their albums from 1963, Please Please Me and with the Beatles. In 1966, after they released Revolver, on August 5th of 1966, they went on tour. John, they didn't play one track from Revolver. So we have to ask ourselves, how could a band, or why would a band who just released a brand new album, it's a turnkey album. Revolver was really the setup to Sgt. Pepper in the psychedelic era. Why did they not play one song off of Revolver? The answer to that, well, my answer to that is because they weren't taught the songs to play. Because if you have a new album out, you're going to play at least a couple of tracks off that album in order to promote the album. And they did not do that. So they're in Hamburg starting in August of 1960. And then in 1961, they're doing all of these live performances within the UK and Hamburg. So from Germany, August of 1960, they did Germany from August of 1960 through December of 1962. If you go on to Wikipedia and take a look, type in, do a search on the Beatles live shows, and take a look at the number of live shows they were doing. It was virtually every single day. Who's booking these shows? Why are these shows being booked? How is a band that is not very good, a rough around the edges bar and club band, how are they getting all of these bookings? So this is something we have to start thinking through. And then something very interesting happens January 1st of 1962, basically 16 months, 1 year and 4 months after their debut in Hamburg, they land an audition with Decca Records on January 1st of 1962. How did that happen? What did they have? What did they achieve? What did they have under their belt that would get them in the door to do a audition with Decca Records? So they go to Decca and we're told that they did 15 songs within several hours, and 3 of those songs were original compositions. Like Dreamers Do, Hello Little Girl, and Love of the Loved. We're told that those were Lennon and McCartney originals. Like Dreamers Do and Hello Little Girl wind up on Anthology 1. Love of the Loved, I think, is officially unreleased. Okay, so 2 of the 3 songs wind up on Anthology, and one of them, at least to the best of my knowledge today, is still unreleased. Decca declines. Decca says, no, not going to sign you. Okay, so somehow they wind up going to Decca on January 1st, 1962. They do 15 songs, 3 originals, and Decca turns them down. Then what happens is in February of 1962, Brian Epstein takes tapes to George Martin of EMI. Now, the other thing we have to remember about George Martin is George Martin was not just a producer. George Martin was the head of the Parlophone label, which came in under EMI. So George wasn't just a producer. George was the head of the Parlophone label. So Brian Epstein pitches the demos to George Martin, and George Martin says, not interested. Based upon what I'm hearing here, I'm not going to sign them. Now they've been turned down twice. And I'll get into some of what George Martin said in a bit, because it's very important. Turned down by Decca, turned down by EMI, and now the Beatles land a gig with the BBC in March of 1962. So a month after George Martin says, yeah, not interested, somehow they wind up on the BBC. The BBC is obviously a mainstream media outlet, and we have to ask ourselves, what strings were being pulled to make that happen? They failed in Hamburg, Decca turns them down, EMI turns them down, and the BBC says, yeah, come on in. So their BBC shows ran from March of 62 through May of 1965. And many of you may have the Beatles live at the BBC sessions. Just so you know, they were not live. They were pre-recorded. They did takes and overdubs. Okay. And I actually did a presentation on that. I'm convinced that those BBC sessions, especially between 1963 and 1965, the instrumentals were performed by studio musicians with the Beatles singing the vocals, just like they did on Rubber Soul. So then what happens is in June of 1962, there's a change of heart. George Martin decides that he is going to sign the Beatles, and he signs into a contract in June of 1962. Now, in Joseph Nies-Goda's book, he says that that contract was actually signed in May of 1962, but the prevailing date that I have found is June. So let's just say May, June, but June being the date you're going to see most often if you do the research. So he signs them. So the question becomes, why the about face? Why did he turn around and say, yeah, I'll sign him after he said that he wasn't interested? I can only speculate on this. There's a couple of stories out there. I won't get into great detail because it'll take up too much time. But I think what happened was, if I had to guess, and it is a guess, the way the Masonic structure works, it's like a big corporate pyramid. And not everybody is aware or brought into the loop at the same time. So I think it's possible at the time when Brian Epstein brought these tapes to George Martin was not yet brought into the loop with regard to what the Beatles were going to be used for, what their role was going to be. So he turned them down. And he should have turned them down because they were not a very good band and they didn't have any songwriting prowess. So he did what any producer or record label owner or head of a record label would do when they heard a band that wasn't very good. They would say, no, thank you. So in memoirs, it tells us that he received a phone call from upstairs from one of his bosses. Now, who would that be? Well, his immediate boss at the time was a guy by the name of Len Wood, but the head of EMI was Sir Joseph Lockwood. I think what happened was it was either Len Wood or Joseph Lockwood himself who made the phone call and said, no, George, we're going to take him on, so bring him in. Then George is brought into the loop as to why, because I'm sure George asked the question, why do we want these guys? They didn't show me anything. And then there had to be a conversation that said, look, there's stuff going on, take them on, and then we're going to bring you in. We'll explain the whole thing. When George first takes them on, he doesn't work with them directly. He assigns it to Ron Richards. Ron Richards was another producer with Parlophone, EMI. Ron later went on to produce the Hollies. Now, Ron was no slouch. So he starts to work with the Beatles in the studio, getting them to record, and it doesn't work out. In fact, I have a chart where I take my audience through an interview that their sound engineer who worked with George Martin at the time, Norman Smith, said that in a New Musical Express music publication back in 1971, he said that they failed in the studio. They didn't have the chops. And if I have a chance, I'll show you that article. So what happens is Ron's working with them. He's trying to get something out of them. He's not getting anything out of them. And the way the story goes, as it's explained in the book, George Martin and Brian Epstein are listening to the playback, and there's nothing there. Now, we have to understand that George Martin worked with professional studio musicians. That's how the music industry works. They don't have the time or the desire to bring people in and sit down like they're sitting around a campfire with their arms around everybody and telling them, don't worry, I'll nurture you, I'll teach you, I'll do this, I'll do that. It's a business. So they didn't have time for this. They didn't have time for non-performers. In fact, Quincy Jones, Quincy has passed now, but going back maybe 3 or 4 years ago, in an interview, he called the Beatles, in particular Ringo Starr and Paul McCartney, no playing MFers. This is Quincy Jones, another producer. So now what happens is George gets another phone call. Memoirs is telling us this narrative. He's told, no more delegating. You got to take it on, George. It's you. They're yours. And so that's when the relationship between the Beatles and George Martin really came together. And when George Martin first got them, he said what he needed to do was to go out and find songs that they could sing. Here's an article. Can you see that, John?
Yep, I can see that.
Here's an article from the Mersey Beat. It was a music publication back in the day. It's the August-September of 1962 issue. And the headline of the article says that the Beatles changed drummers. So this was about Pete Best out, Ringo in. Pete Best was the Beatles' original drummer, and then Ringo joins them. And again, this is August 23rd through September, I think this is 6th of 1962. Now, along with announcing that Pete's out, Ringo's in, the article goes on to say that the Beatles will fly to London to make recordings at EMI Studios. They will be recording numbers that have been specifically written for the group, which they have received from the recording manager, George Martin. The article does not say that they're going to record songs written by them. It says they're going to record numbers that have been specifically written for the group. And this coalesces with what George Martin had said in various interviews, that when he first got them, he needed to go find songs for them. Now, let me just take you through some things that George said. In his own words, I already mentioned that when Brian Epstein brought the tapes to him in February of 1962, George said, if you want me to judge them based on what you're playing me, I'm sorry, I need to turn you down. And then on meeting the Beatles in 1962, in another interview, he said, I wasn't terribly impressed with the first stuff they did. In the documentary produced by George Martin, George is talking to Howard Goodall. Howard is another composer and a broadcaster. He's very accomplished. And George says to him, they had this wonderful charisma. They made you feel good. I thought their music was rubbish. And he goes on to say that even though they had really nothing behind them, they were still fairly irreverent. And then he says, so I looked at these 4 guys and thought none of them shines above all the others. Now think about that, John. Paul McCartney and John Lennon are supposed to be these prolific genius songwriters.
Yeah.
He gets them and he says, I look at these 4 guys and none of them shines above all the others. And he said that Love Me Do was the best song he could find from them. He was very conscious it was not the big hit he was looking for. And then in another interview, he goes on to say that they certainly had no, and during this interview, when George says this, he pauses because he's measuring his words now. He says they certainly had no, and then he says it wasn't too obvious they could be songwriters at this stage. Love Me Do was the best thing that they had. And that's if they even wrote Love Me Do. this is an interesting set of quotes from George Martin, because if we go back to bullet number 1 here, from the Complete Beatles, the documentary, it said that Lennon and McCartney allegedly wrote 100 songs between them from 1956 to 1962.
Where are they?
Where are they?
Yeah.
Where are they? And as I mentioned, the 3 songs, original compositions that they allegedly wrote and recorded at the Decca audition, none of those songs were on any of the recordings at the records or the singles or albums that the Beatles released while the band was together between 1962 through 1970. So if we stay on this chart for a second, so now we have these quotes from George Martin. We know now that the Beatles don't have songs. The Beatles are not these great musicians, skilled musicians. But on March 22nd, 1963, that's 322, folks, for those of you who are into the occult, Skull and Bones, Genesis 322. 9 months after the EMI contract is signed, they released their first album. And the first album has 8 original songs on it. So they went from having no songs, from George Martin saying, I have to go find them songs, to going back to the Mercy Beat article saying that they were going to record songs written for them, to releasing an album with 14 songs, of which 8 we're told were original compositions. And then 8 months after Please Please Me is released, that's their debut album. And by the way, their UK albums are their official releases. It is not the US Capitol albums. UK albums are their official releases. On November 22nd, 1963, the same day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated in the United States, they released their second album, 14 songs, 8 originals. So they show up in June of 1962. They don't have any songs. They don't have anything.
They've got Love Me Do, right?
Let's just say they had that one. Personally, yeah. I'm not convinced they actually even wrote that, to be honest with you. But in any case, middle of June of 1962, 9 months later, they released their first album, 8 original songs. And then 8 months later after that, they have another 8 original songs. And now they have 16 original compositions, when before they had essentially 0. Now, to put it into perspective, folks, let's take a look at elapsed time. So from Hamburg, August of 1960 to the Decca audition, that took 1 year and 4 months. Now remember, when they showed up in Hamburg, they had absolutely nothing. Marginal musicians, no songwriting prowess, yet 16 months after they show up in Hamburg, Germany, they're sitting in Decca, cutting a demo. From Hamburg, August 1960 to their EMI contract, 1 year and 10 months. Quite a feat. From Hamburg to their first album, Please Please Me, 2 years and 7 months. From Hamburg to With the Beatles, their second album, 3 years and 3 months. And from Hamburg, August of 1960 to the United States in February of 1964, February 7th of 1964, 3 years and 5 months. Rockets on their shoes. So they went from 0 to hero in 3.5 years. And when the Beatles arrived in America, the tagline was, the Beatles conquer America. And for those of you who don't think that words mean anything, those phrases, those slogans are put out there for a reason. That's one of the Frankfurt School's big things, was slogans. Put slogans out. People catch on to slogans. They like to repeat them. So the only way that any of this can really happen, I concluded, there was the machine behind the band. These guys were groomed, handled, and they were pulled along. Because when you look at this chart, at least when I look at this chart, that's a lot of stuff that had to go down in a short period of time for these guys to end up in America on February 7th of 1964, all the way here on the right-hand side. Now, the book also tells us that John Lennon and Paul McCartney entered into a Faustian bargain, a deal with the devil, on October 24th of 1963. So it took place after their first album was released, and to a lot of fanfare and a lot of success. The way these Faustian bargains work is you get a taste of success, they whet your appetite, and then they say, do you like it? You like the success? You like the money? You like the fame? You like the notoriety? You like the popularity? Oh yeah, I love all of that stuff. You want more of it? Oh yeah, I want more of that. Okay, we can make that happen. So the book tells us that a Faustian bargain was done on October 24th of 1963. Now, did it? I don't know. I wasn't there. But I will tell you that these Faustian bargains and these deals do happen. They do take place. We can point to the whole 27 Club as one small example.
Michael, just quickly going to mention on that, I've interviewed guests with this, and someone was saying who's actually in the satanic ritual world. They said that what happens is it's every 13 years that there's a ritual that they have to take part in. So you have one at 13, one at 26, and so that's why a lot of them die at 27 because they just say, I don't want to do it anymore, and so that's they're taken out.
Yeah, and 13 is a very important number in the occult.
Yeah.
So this, John, is, in a nutshell, how I concluded that this was all constructed. This was all manufactured. In fact, there's a quote from Davy Jones of the Monkees. He did an interview going back a long time ago. And in that interview, he said that the Monkees were not the first manufactured band. He said it was the Beatles. And Davy goes on to explain, with the boots and the haircuts and all that stuff, they were the first manufactured band.
I mean, I do have a question. So maybe this will come up later, but if they did do the Faustian bargain and they were socially engineered and potentially even, they could have even been MK Ultra mind control slaves, right? From a very early age, who knows? But like, why then was John Lennon so anti-government? Why was he so against the script? Why was he going off script then? Because he said our society is run by insane people for insane objectives. I think we're being run by maniacs for maniacal ends, and I think I'm liable to be put away as insane for expressing that.
I think Lennon struggled. He knew he was participating in something that wasn't truthful. He, of all the Beatles, was the most vocal in dropping clues about what was going on. And he was trying to vocalize, whether through interviews or songs, to try to get the word out.
So they did write songs. So they did write songs to try and change things up a little bit. Then
solo career, yes.
Solo career only. Would you say that's why they killed him then, or not?
It's possible. I don't really know why John was taken out. In Joseph Niesgoda's book, Lennon Prophecy, he says that John entered into a Faustian bargain in December of 1960, and he said that the shelf life for that Faustian bargain was 20 years. So that takes us to December of 1980. Now, is that the case? I don't know. Memoir says the Faustian bargain that Lennon and McCartney entered into was October of 1963. Is it possible that Lennon did 2 Faustian bargains? I guess that's possible. But then again, they were so young, they probably had no idea what it is that they were doing, what it is they were involved in, what it is they were signing up for.
Right.
And it is possible that he was opening his mouth too much and he was taken out.
Yeah. I'm guessing they still worry about someone as influential as John Lennon. They still saw him as a threat.
They saw him as a threat because he was very influential. And of course, his influence was created by them. There are times when the person that they have groomed and the person they have handled breaks out of the conditioning and starts to verbalize and talk about what's really going on. I mean, we have other examples of this. It's not just John Lennon, where people who are in mind control programs have broken the programming or the conditioning and have stepped out and started to talk about it. If somebody that they have created has a lot of influence and they start cutting across the grain, they're going to do something about that. His song Imagine, what is the lyrics in Imagine? Imagine no possessions.
Oh, wow, yeah.
So Imagine no possessions is you'll own nothing and be happy.
I was just going to say, Klaus, that's
Exactly.
a Davos World Economic Forum mantra.
Imagine there's no heaven, no God, godless. This is the agenda of the controllers. They are the gods. In fact, Yuval Harari, that nut job, was running around saying they have achieved godlike status. And he went on to say that Jesus is fake news. And by the way, Memoirs tells us that John didn't write Imagine, that it was generously credited to him, given to him to perform.
Oh.
On one hand, John's talking about how we have to break free from this stuff, but then he sings a song saying, Imagine no possessions. It's easy if you try. Okay, well, which is it? Again, it goes back to the complexities of what's going on, and people who are delivering the message, I don't think they always know. They're not completely in the know, I should say, with what's really going on above them. Everything is compartmentalized. They're on a need-to-know basis. They're given enough information to perform their job, their task.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah, no, we could talk. I mean, you can see I've got so many questions, but I don't want to derail the whole
just keep
thing.
going.
I don't want to derail it. Where do you think we should go? Because obviously I'm really interested in the dark occultist stuff. I'm really interested in the Fool stuff, because I haven't spoken to a real expert on that yet.
Why don't we take a look at Paul McCartney?
Yeah.
And show some images of Paul?
Yeah, let's do that. All right.
All right. So early on, back in 2016, I put some charts together to take a look at this whole Paul is dead bit. And again, remember when I first got into this, I thought Paul was always Paul, and the whole Paul is dead thing was just a clever, witty marketing program that the Beatles rolled out there. But here, picture number one, top left, is biological Paul McCartney. And then take a look at the pictures to the right and then on the bottom row. Number two is not Paul, that's a double. 3 is Billy Shears with a wig. He's got latex. 4 is Billy as well. 5 might be Billy, I don't know. Sometimes it's tough. Here's the thing, I was told by a source that right out of the chute, when the Beatles were created, there were 3 doubles and lookalikes for each Beatle. That's why it's difficult sometimes when you look at these images to decipher them, because some of these doubles and lookalikes were very, very good, and it's tough to distinguish and differentiate between the real guy and the double or the lookalike. 6, another iteration of Paul McCartney, another double. 7, 8 is Billy. So if you take a look at picture number 1, just take a step back and look at those pictures and think to yourself, does 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 look like the guy in number 1? Exactly like the guy in number 1. Some people might say, well, he resembles him. Yeah, he's supposed to resemble him, but it's not him. Let's go to page number 2. And here are other images of Paul McCartney. Number 2 is supposed to be Paul McCartney in Hamburg. What the control system has been doing, Tavistock has been doing, and the machine behind the whole Beatle psyop, they have been doctoring images since day one. So here what we have is we have a hybrid image blending Paul McCartney with Billy. Take a look at picture number 4. That's Billy. Number 2 is a combination of 4 and let's say number 1, even though this would be when Paul was younger, back in the Hamburg days. So number 2 is a hybrid. This image has been doctored. Number 3, I don't know who that is, to be honest with you. 4 is Billy. 5 is Billy. 6 is another lookalike or a double. 7 is Billy. 8 is Billy.
Why 6 could not be a young Billy?
Take a look at Billy's nose. So Billy's nose here, let's go to image number 4. His nose is narrow, it's beaked. Now, what happened was over time, he had plastic surgery done on his nose. And we could see where the nostrils, here the nostrils are more flared here. They got pulled in to look like Paul's. This is clearly not Paul McCartney. So number 5, that's not Paul McCartney.
Yeah.
6 is a tough one. But the interesting thing with 6 is he looks somewhat like Paul, but it's not him. First of all, his hair is parted kind of like to the left middle. Paul's hair was always parted on the left-hand side. We've got these different faces of Paul McCartney. And what they did, John, was to create a composite Paul McCartney. So when we look at Paul McCartney, people say, well, back in 1964, when this was taken, I think it was 64, 65, that's Paul McCartney. Okay, that's Paul McCartney. Then we get to Sgt. Pepper. We get to picture number 3, the Sgt. Pepper era. We're told that's Paul McCartney. Then we get to the Wings days, picture number 8, we're told that's Paul McCartney. So it's not until you lay out the collage that you start to see all the differences. That's why I created this slide here. Not the same guy. Billy has an elongated face. He has a different nose. He just looks different.
Not only that, Mike, but character-wise, temperament-wise, the original seemed very unassuming, sweet, kind of innocent, sort of gentle, delicate, and then the new one comes on. He seems a bit of an arsehole, to be honest, you know.
Yeah, much different personalities. Billy is taller than Paul by about 2 inches or so.
Yeah, that's why he's always barefoot. That's why they started doing him barefoot in some of the album covers and stuff like that, right?
Whenever you look at the images of them together and it's Billy, you will see that the way he is standing, he's either leaning back, he's leaning to the side, he's trying to reduce his size.
Yep.
He has a more elongated face, he has different ears, he has a different nose, especially in the beginning, and I'll show you images of that. Most importantly, Billy has a prosthetic right eye. He's blind in his right eye. And of course, right. Paul had 2 good eyes. Billy's blind in his right eye. This was a discovery made by my colleague, Sally Whitty. Sally's a great researcher, and she is blind in her left eye. And she was looking at images and videos of Billy, and she noticed that his eyes weren't always syncing up. And as she looked more and more into it, she called it out. And Billy actually confirmed this to us in an interview that he did with an exhibit going back about a year ago. Was the Eyes of the Storm exhibit. And he's going through the exhibit area, and he's with an interviewer. I think it was CBS or ABC here in the States. And they stop at this one picture and they're talking about it. And these images were supposedly images that Paul took back in 1964, allegedly. And so as they're talking about it, the person who's interviewing Billy, Paul McCartney, says, well, you really have to have an eye to take a picture like that. And Billy looks at the image, he steps forward, and he goes, yes, my left one. So he's saying, I only have sight in my left eye. Sally's discovery, like my work on the music, actually made its way into the memoirs of Billy Shears. So the book was updated to bring in her discovery of Billy being blind in his right eye, and also my research on the music.
Wow. Good work.
We have the same thing with John Lennon, by the way.
Yeah.
There you go. Same thing.
So you mentioned they had doubles, right? And I'm guessing that must have been because they had such a hectic schedule with performing every single night pretty much, right? That they just had to because it would just been too draining. That's how they sold it to them anyway, was it maybe?
It was the performance, it was the interviews, it was a lot of stuff. The Beatles, their schedule was unbelievably hectic.
Yeah.
You go back to 1963, the height of Beatlemania, 1964 going into 65, it was hectic. And so they would have these doubles and lookalikes. It's like, you ever see these Beatle tribute bands like Rain and the Fab Four, bands like that? Very good performers, very good band. I've gone to a number of these shows. I enjoy them. When you're looking at the people playing the role of Paul McCartney or John Lennon or George Harrison or Ringo Starr on stage, the way the makeup is done and all that, some of these performers, they look very good as far as looking like the actual person. I remember seeing Rain going back several years ago, and the guy that was playing Paul McCartney, I was shocked at how much that guy looked like Paul McCartney. From the Fab Four, the guy that plays George Harrison, when he's up in his makeup and his costumes, he's a dead ringer.
Where do they get them from, though? Like, they can't just put an ad in the local newspaper, can they? Like, how are they sourcing them?
I'm going to assume, John, that these are people that are in the pipeline,
right?
In the deep state pipeline. These are people that are in programs or whatever. Look, I have a guy that contacted me several years back, and he said to me that he was stopped on 2 different occasions here in the United States in 2 different cities. Person came up to them, and not the same person, and said, you would make a very good double of Paul McCartney. It's Billy, but people think he's Paul McCartney.
Yeah.
It happened once, and then he's in a different city, and he was approached again. And almost the identical conversation, same dialogue. But the second time, I think, he said, the guy said, say something. He's Southern, so he had like a Southern accent. And he said, well, we'd have to work on the accent. We would have to work on the accent. He sent me a picture of himself. This is before I went to lunch with him. And I got to tell you, John, he had a very strong resemblance to an older Paul McCartney, to an older Billy. And I can see if you were scouting this type of thing, where you would look at him and say, we can work with him.
Yeah.
We can do something to make him, cosmetics, whatever, even surgically, to make him look like Paul McCartney.
How can you make sure that they're great musicians, though, as well? Or are they miming that then? If you take someone off the street because they're a dead ringer and they put them in as a double, are they actually not playing their instruments, or they're pretending to play on stage?
That's a good question. Okay, so here's the thing. 1962 to 1966, the Beatles did not write their songs. That's number one. Number two is they were not on the recorded tracks. Okay, so we're talking about recordings now, folks. Not playing live. There's 2 separate things going on. 2 very distinct scenarios going on here. Bernard Purdy, who is the great studio drummer who drummed for Aretha Franklin for 25 years, back in 1978, opened a can of worms and said that he drummed on 21 Beatle tracks. Not just the Tony Sheridan tracks. A lot of people want to say, no, he drummed on the Tony Sheridan tracks. He did. He drummed on the Tony Sheridan tracks and 21 Beatle tracks from the early albums. And when we're talking about the early albums, we're talking about Please Please Me with the Beatles going into A Hard Day's Night. And there could have been songs that Bernard drummed on after A Hard Day's Night. In an interview that he did in 2004 with Red Bull, Bernard said that there were 4 drummers on the Beatles' music, and he said Ringo was not one of them. And he was talking about the recorded tracks. Later on, starting with Sgt. Pepper, Ringo drummed on more tracks, and John and George played on more tracks. But studio musicians were still being utilized even in the 67 through 70 period. Glenn Campbell, who was the guitar virtuoso, played for the Wrecking Crew. We talked about the Wrecking Crew earlier. In July of 1968, he was co-hosting the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, and he was introducing the band Cream. So that would be Ginger Baker, Eric Clapton, and Jack Bruce. In the introduction, Glenn, who was a studio musician, said that Cream were the cream of the crop of studio musicians coming out of England, and that they played on Beatle records, along with the Rolling Stones, and he named off a number of other acts. The point I'm trying to make is that there's information out there, there's little cracks in the dam, which are telling us that the Beatles were not what we were told that they were. There's a Hulu special, McCartney 321, where Billy's there, Paul McCartney's there with Rick Rubin, and Rick Rubin brings up the recording of While My Guitar Gently Weeps, and he isolates the bass track. And Rick Rubin's going on and on about what a great bass track it is and how aggressive it is, and listen to the tone and the sound of the bass on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. And Billy's sitting there, or Paul McCartney's sitting there, and he is as astounded and as impressed with it as Rick Rubin. Never added any insight into what bass he played, how he got that tone. You know what that told me? That told me that
he can't do it.
He didn't play the bass on that song.
Yeah. I get that they've got different people in the recording studio, but what I mean is if you're bringing in doubles to perform live, they have to be a certain level of musician to be able to play those instruments in a way that's going to at least appear as though they're half decent, right?
Yeah, let's move from the studio to the live stuff, okay?
Yeah.
All right. Most of the time in the live stuff in the early days, it was them. It was the original guys.
Mm-hmm.
There's a theory out there that during the August 1966 concerts here in Seattle and so on, that there was a double for Paul on stage. And if that's the case, and he was indeed playing, I'll get to that in a moment, then they would have had to have found somebody that is a musician that can play the bass and play along. That's one scenario. But here's the other thing. Many times when the Beatles were performing live, they were playing to backing tracks, or they had backstage musicians actually doing the playing, and the Beatles were on stage miming. Sounds like heresy to a lot of people. But we have proof of this.
Yeah.
The proof is Budokan in 1966 and the song Day Tripper. It's the first couple of bars of Day Tripper. We have the iconic riff. Bow, ba, 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 ba. Guess what? John and George are not playing the riff. They're clearly not playing it, but it's being played. Yeah. How is that happening? There are either musicians backstage or offstage who are playing, or they're playing to a backing track. I have a guy that I know, very accomplished studio musician, who wrote me when I first showed that clip, and he said to me, Mike, you're absolutely right. He says, I used to do that work. He goes, I didn't do it for the Beatles. He says, but I used to do that work. I would be backstage or offstage with my guitar, and they would mime on stage. So this is what goes on behind the scenes. I recently received an audio that a person sent me, did a wonderful job. He took 2 different concerts that the Beatles did. One was Dodger Stadium, and I think the other one was Candlestick Park. August of 1966, after they released Revolver. And the song was She's a Woman. He queued up the song from beginning to end, John, for both concerts. And guess what? They both map identically, which means they were playing to a backing track. Because the possibility that 2 different times that you play the song, that everything lines up and matches up, the drums, the guitars, everything matches up identically from performance to performance, is practically nil, especially when we're talking about the tempo of a song. Because when you play live, the tempo is going to shift a little bit, 120 beats per minute, 121, 122, 119, because it's live. So that says, what does that say, folks? That says that they were playing to a backing track. They were had offstage musicians like they did in Budokan, or that was a backing track as well. Now, the question becomes, did the Beatles ever play any of their shows as Beatles, when they were playing live? Yeah, they did. But what I have found is Typically, the bigger the venue, the more we run into backing tracks and studio players doing the actual instrumentals. They would sing the vocals live, but the instrumentation wasn't always them. I'm not going to say it was never them. It wasn't always them. So you had a combination of them playing live. You had musicians playing backstage. They were miming. Backing tracks. They were miming. They played to a backing track on the Ed Sullivan Show. People don't want to believe this. I have a clip of the Dave Clark Five on the Ed Sullivan Show, and guess what happened? The backing track failed. And I actually have the footage of this, and the Dave Clark Five is standing there, and there's no music. No music. It went dead. We have to understand that there is so much invested in this, so much money invested in this, whether it's the Beatles or not. We're talking about these big name bands, performers, entertainers. You're going on the Ed Sullivan Show in front of millions and millions of people. They're not going to take a chance that the song's going to get flubbed, that a lyric is going to be forgotten, that there's going to be a screw up on the guitar.
Yeah.
Ringo's going to miss something on the drums. It's just not going to happen, especially when you're talking about when the Beatles were first introduced into the United States. They're going to make sure that that is buffed up and polished up and that there is virtually no room for error. Now, the other thing, too, when people watch these clips on YouTube and they listen to it and they go, wow, that sounds really good. Listen to how good they're playing. Many of those clips that you're watching on YouTube, especially like the performances at Shea Stadium and other big venues, those clips were enhanced post-production to make sure that the audio was spruced up and everything was synced up so that you get the best listening experience. They could put the best product forward. There was a Beatles official publication in October of 1965. I forgot the name of the publication, but in it, it explained that Brian Epstein wanted to release the footage of the concert at Shea Stadium, but they had to do overdubs, especially with the vocals, because of all the screaming that took place at the venue at Shea Stadium. So when you have all this screaming going on, that's all going to bleed into the microphones, whether it be the vocal mics or whether it be the amplifiers or how the drums are mic'd. You're going to get that. It's just the way it works. It's a microphone and you're going to get bleed. But that article said they were going to overdub the vocals on that Shea Stadium performance. So my take on it is that if that Beatles official magazine from 1965 admitted to overdubbing the vocals, then they're going to overdub anything else that doesn't sound right. Because again, it's a product. People, they don't want to hear this because the Beatles are the soundtrack of their life. And here's Mike raining on everybody's parade. But the music business is a business. I have a friend of mine who's a sound engineer, has worked with big bands out in Europe. And he was telling me, Mike, all of these live performances that you're hearing, signed to labels and all that stuff, he says the amount of work that goes into to release these live recordings, he says so much of it is redone in the studio. The audience is enhanced, guitar tracks will be re-recorded, drums will be re-recorded. That's what Bernard Purdy was doing. He was fixing the drum tracks on the Beatle recordings.
But Billy Shears, let's say, let's just go with him for an example. He actually was a very talented musician, was he not? And then he was actually performing on stage and playing the instruments, and they must have struck gold when they got him in, no?
I think Billy was with them for a long time. I think Billy goes back to at least 1962. In the book, he tells us he was a session musician. He's very accomplished at vocal mimicry, and that was one of his talents. He tells us in the book that he was hired to do sessions where a particular vocalist or singer couldn't make it for whatever reason, and Billy would fill in and he would sing the tracks. He is by trade a wind instrument player and a piano player.
Yeah.
But he's also obviously a guitar player, and he could play bass. He's naturally right-handed. Mike Stock, who I did an interview with, Mike is very accomplished. He's out of the UK. He did some work with Billy. He told me he walked into a studio and Billy was playing right-handed. Mike walked in at the time. Mike thought he was Paul McCartney, didn't know that about the Billy Shears character. And so Mike, he goes, wow, he goes, you're a pretty good right-handed guitar player for a guy that's lefty. And so Billy or Paul says to Mike, he says, well, back in the day, they didn't have a lot of left-handed instruments, so we had to try to teach myself how to play right-handed. It's not a good answer, right? Because if you're a left-handed guitar player and there weren't a lot of left-handed guitars back in the day, you took a right-handed guitar, you flipped it, and you just restrung the guitar like Jimi Hendrix did. You don't have to teach yourself to play right-handed. The truth of the matter is the reason why he was playing right-handed is because Billy plays right-handed. So when he's in the studio recording, he's not recording left-handed, he's recording right-handed. Maybe these days
He plays
he
left-handed
could
now,
do it
though.
left-handed because he's
Yeah,
got it.
yeah, because he's just practiced so
Well, he
much.
plays
Yeah,
he plays
yeah,
left-handed, right? I mean, he's
yeah,
probably he's competent. He's very competent. He's a very
yeah,
talented guy.
yeah.
He's right. So there's no taking that away. But he is naturally right-handed, and Mike
Right.
Stock walked in and saw him playing right-handed.
Yeah, it's funny because my dad, his friend used to do work in Billy's house. I can't remember what it was, like doing the radiators or something like that. And he used to hear him and who was he going out? Who was his first wife? Linda McCartney. He was saying they were always arguing with each other, and he was like reporting back on like some of the it was just like non-stop arguments in the house. But he was actually in there. He was actually just doing the house repairs or whatever. But also I was going to ask you if it's all right, Mike. I mean, so how is it then that Billy was able to get the teeth looking the same? Because he's got very small teeth, the original Paul McCartney, very kind of like, and he's got very bird-like lips, and his eyes are kind of, like they're kind of down. How would you say? They droop down. And was there a time
Yeah.
when Billy obviously went off and had that work done? I've heard stories about him getting that done in Africa. I don't know, but is this part of your presentation?
So what happened was this is going to be very difficult for a lot of people to get their heads wrapped around. This was a deep state operation, so
Yeah,
there was no expense spared to make this happen. The Beatles were very important
yeah,
to kick off the counterculture and to do what it is that they did, which was to get the ball rolling in a big way on
yeah,
changing societal norms and all that stuff. Because anytime you ever read anything on the Beatles, you watch a documentary, what do they always tell us? They were a cultural phenomenon.
mm,
They changed the culture. The teeth, that was all done by going in and doing dental surgery to get the teeth positioned so that it resembled Paul McCartney. The book tells us the same thing was done for scars, and if there were some moles or whatever, they were surgically done so that he had what Paul had, at least those things that were noticeable. So here's a chart that I put together because people ask about the eyes a lot. First of all, let me show you one thing here. The guy on the right is Vivian Stanshall. This is the guy that played in the Bonzo Dog Band with Neil Innes. Neil Innes was with the Ruddles. This is Vivian Stanshall. It's a character. This is Billy on the right-hand side.
that's Billy.
Yep.
So that is the original of Billy on the right.
Yep.
No.
Uh-huh. Yep.
What?
That's him. Yep. It'll make more sense in a bit. So here he is as an older Paul McCartney, right?
Mm.
The guy on the left, to me, looks like an older version of the guy on the right. Take a look at the eyes. The Stanshall character has a lazy or wandering left eye, or at least it appears that way. This is a presentation I did back in 2019. I looked at this 5 years ago, 6 years ago now. And we can see the same eye anomaly right here. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look. The left eye has this wandering look to it. But what's really going on? Is it really a lazy left eye? No, it goes back to what I said before. His left eye is his good eye. His right eye is his blind eye. So what happens is, what I've noticed is when Billy looks left, especially when he looks hard left, the right eye doesn't always track. Now, another problem or another thing that people bring up because they don't understand it, they said, well, artificial eyes don't move. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Most artificial eyes have movement. The only time they wouldn't is if the eye is so damaged, then the eye would be static. But most artificial eyes, I'll show you what it looks like this on the right-hand side.
Yeah.
And it's placed over the ocular part of the eye. So when the eye moves left or right, well, that ocular prosthetic moves left or right. The muscles move left and right, it moves. It's incorrect when people make a blanket statement and say people who have artificial eyes don't have movement in the artificial eye, in the blind eye. It's not true.
Okay.
Are there scenarios when there is no movement? Yes, but in many, many cases. So Billy has movement in his eye. Here, take a look. I blocked it off. So we can see he's looking straight ahead on the left here. Second picture in, his left eye is looking more to our right. Stanshall is looking straight at us, just like the first picture, straight at us with his fake eye, his artificial eye. And then in the fourth picture, he's looking to our right.
So this is the guy that they used and turned into Paul McCartney then. But so he didn't look anything like Paul McCartney at this stage. They had to do so much work on him to make him appear. Paul McCartney, the original, has got those droopy eyes, hasn't he?
People bring that up. Well, how do you change the shape of the eyes? How does that work? It's called a blepharoplasty, or a bleph for short.
Mm.
And a blepharoplasty is a surgical procedure that removes excess fat, muscle, skin from the upper and lower eyelids to redefine the shape of the eye. So we could take a look here. Here he is in his McCartney character on the left-hand side. Here we have him in his Stanchel character on the right-hand side. Let's take a close look at these pictures. And here on the right is him without his mustache. Very difficult to find images of him in the Stanchel character without a mustache. Look at the eyes. Again, we have the left eye not totally in sync with the right eye. Look at the nose. Look at the crease by the nose. The exact same mustache. Look at the mouth. The way the mouth opens, it's the same mouth. The ears look the same, even though it's harder to see on the Stanchel character. But if you look at the ligament or the cartilage around the outside of the ear right here on the McCartney character, and you look at it over here, it's the same. And what he has on his head is a wig.
Right.
I've determined that Billy did a couple of things with his hair. It's either wigs or he had a hair weave. So hair weaves are great because you can actually run your hands through them and not have to worry about the wig coming off. Notice the overall facial structure, the jawline, the mouth, the mustache, and the ear. Talked about the eyes. Let me show you something here. Let me see if I have something here I can show you that will blow your mind. Because sometimes people look at this and like, well, I don't know.
The teeth are identical to the original Paul McCartney, and they're not kind of perfectly straight. They're kind of...
He had the teeth surgically rearranged, moved.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean,
Yeah.
think about it, folks. You could do it with braces. If you have crooked teeth, what do? They take braces and they fix your teeth. Can they take your teeth and move them around? Yes, they can move them around as well. So that's what was done. And today, he doesn't have the Paul McCartney teeth anymore. He has a whole different set of teeth. Take a look at this, John. That's Billy, and that's Paul McCartney's son, James McCartney.
Oh, I see.
Do we not see a family resemblance? That's Billy. That's his son, James. That's Paul McCartney's son, James. Billy's son. In the book, he admits, he says, my son looks a lot like I looked before the transformation, before all the surgeries and the cosmetics, and he used a lot of latex, by the way. I have videos of evidence of the latex on my channel.
Yeah.
Where you can see where he's touching himself and the latex is stretching. And
where did he have it done, though? Like, where did he go off to get it done and the eyes done and everything?
I don't know where he had it done. I mean, I know about the Kenya film, and there's a lot of speculation that he was out in Kenya having work done. That could very well be, by the way. I'm not saying that's not true. I don't know. It was a process that took multiple surgeries. When surgery was not yet at that point where he had the resemblance close enough, then what was being used was latex.
Yeah.
I'm trying to see if there's another image I have here.
They must have given that same surgery to all the doubles as well.
Yes, I mean, they would have had to have been worked on. Yes.
Yeah.
Here's another image of him. This is his profile as Stanchel. Here's his profile as McCartney. You can see the whole slope of the forehead is the same. The indentation and the nose is the same. Take a look at the jawline. That's the same. And of course, this is many years later. What's happened is, as the years have gone by, the plastic surgery is not holding up like it used to. So we're seeing him look more like himself. Here's one.
Because I've always wondered,
John?
like, you see him now with like blonde hair, and it's almost as if he's given up dyeing it dark, and he's got people used to the idea.
He doesn't care anymore.
He doesn't care anymore. Yeah, I've noticed that.
Doesn't care anymore. His arms are all light. So in the book, it tells us that what he did as McCartney, because people say, oh, well, he had his arms exposed or his legs exposed and he had black hair. And in the book, it explains that he actually dyed his body hair. I went and actually spoke to an esthetician to validate that can you actually dye your body hair? And she told me, absolutely, yes, people dye their body hair. So that's what he did. Now, here's a picture I found. On the left is who people would call Paul McCartney, and on the right would be the Stanchel character. Look at the teeth. Look at the eyes. Now, what he told us was in the book, when he played Stanchel, he pushed his eyebrows down to change the look of his face. And when he played the McCartney character, he raised his eyebrows. But take a look at the chin.
But the Billy, like the original Paul McCartney did have those eyebrows that were like quite high on his head, right? So was that not done with cosmetic surgery as well?
Paul had his right eye especially, the eyebrow had a natural arc to it. And that's something that he got from his father. His father had a very similar eyebrow where it would arc up.
Yeah.
Billy tells us in the book that he had to work intently on working the eye muscles above his eye, especially his right eye, to emulate that arc or arch of Paul's. So it's not something that he was born with like Paul. Paul naturally had that. Billy actually had to work at building up the muscles in his eye, above his eyes, where his eyebrow is, to force that eyebrow up. I know, it sounds crazy, I'm telling you, but...
What's your theory on how he died? Because obviously there's the car crash theory in 66, but I've also heard that he was sacrificed as well.
Yeah, the prevailing conspiracy is he died in a car crash. Now, did he actually die in a car crash? I don't know. He could have. He may not have. The ritual sacrifice piece of it comes into play as well. Was he ritually sacrificed? Now, I interviewed Sharon Clemens, who has a new book out, Forbidden Fruit, and she goes into great detail. She believes that Paul actually was whisked away in late August of 1966. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, Sharon believes that a double was actually used on stage for the two last shows. Sharon, if I'm wrong here, please leave a comment. And that he was ritually sacrificed. In memoirs, it tells us it was a ritual sacrifice, and Billy refers to it as death for success. There's some theories, or hypothesis, I should say, and I think it's Sharon's hypothesis, that the car crash story was created in order to make his death more palatable, more acceptable to people he knew, family members like his father and stuff like that, although I believe his father was probably his handler.
Yeah, in the club.
I believe his father was a high-level Freemason that was bringing his son along. There's another theory that it was a car crash, but that the deep state was involved, created the car crash, and they made sure after the car crash that he was dead. That's another scenario.
Because some of my audience members have said they remember the newspaper reports on him dying in a car crash at the time and family members being very upset about it.
Yes, yep. That was out there. There was also people in the United States who claimed that it was during the Monkees episode. I think the Monkees debuted on September 12th of 1966, which would be the day after Memoirs tells us that Paul actually passed away, September 11th. There was a news blurb, whether on TV or the radio, that said Paul McCartney had died. And it was only said once, and then it just disappeared, and it just went into the memory hole. So there are people that actually remember that.
Yeah.
So the newspaper articles you're talking about, what was said allegedly on American media, could be. I don't know. I mean, I haven't read or heard either one of those things, so I can't really be definitive.
No comment. You know, going back to Vivian Stanshall, so I'm just looking him up here. It says that he died in 1995, and there's images of him like through the years, like getting progressively older. So who is that in those photos? Like
That's Victor.
70s?
What happened was Billy hired Victor to play the role of Stanshall, and I believe that he hired him back in the early 1970s. So Billy was doing double duty. He was doing the Stanshall character, he was playing McCartney, and then he would go do his Stanshall bit for a while. And the Stanshall character a lot of times had a lot of costumes and stuff like that too.
He did it at the same time, so he was actually playing Stanshall and McCartney. Like
at one time, yes, he was paging back and forth. But most of his work was McCartney. So in order to avoid having the Batman and Bruce Wayne phenomenon where they can't be in the same room at the same time because they're the same person, he hired Victor. So let me see if I can find something on Victor here. Hold on. Okay, so here we have the many faces of Vivian Stanshall. So I already covered this is Billy in the top left, and then we start going through all of these images. So 2, 3, and 4 is Billy. 6 appears to be Billy as well, but he has a lot of makeup on.
Oh, 7's is totally different. 8, totally different.
8, 9. This is Billy. 10 is Billy. This is he did this whole effeminate thing with Vivian Stanshall. This is him in the Bonzos, and this is Victor. He was the guy that was hired, and we can see here that they have different noses. Here we have Billy as Paul McCartney, and we have 3 shots or 3 images of him as Stanshall. Here is Billy on the left when he's with the Bonzos, and here is Victor. So we can see Victor is taller, lankier, and look at his hair. He has red hair. Billy has reddish blonde hair. So the person that died in 1995 was Victor, and he died in a fire in his apartment or wherever he lived. That's what Wikipedia is representing. They're representing Victor.
This is absolutely wild.
No, it is wild. Take a look at this one. This is Billy playing Paul McCartney. Here's Billy as Stanshall. And then when you superimpose both pictures, in the McCartney picture, he's got this gigantic wig on his head.
Yeah, but the eyes, like, how can he just adjust the eyes for and toggle between the two?
It's done with latex.
Latex, right.
latex goes back a long time.
Yeah.
Latex was really put into play in Hollywood during The Wizard of Oz.
Hmm.
So that was back in the 1930s. So by the time you're getting to 1967, you're talking about 35 years or so of further development of the use of latex. So, and he tells us in the book that latex was used in order to create the imagery, in order to create the look. Here he is. Maybe he's about 50, 60 here, and go all the way across. This is all latex, folks.
So when you're seeing Billy through the years, like up until the present day, is that latex or is that now how he now looks after surgery? And he's just that's
No, the way in the later years, the way he looks is the way he looks.
yeah,
So
yeah, okay, yeah,
when we see this, that's how he looks today, which is really this guy right here on the left
yeah,
who
yeah.
has aged.
But here's an example. Like, so he's got the droopy eyes there. So are you saying that is latex eyes there or not?
No, this is through a blepharoplasty.
Yeah, okay. So then how does he toggle between like and suddenly become the guy on the right with normal eyes? The two eyes on the left is like the typical mirror replica of Paul McCartney's eyes. And then but suddenly he's saying that he switches character and then how does he get his eyes non like Billy? He's done his eyes exactly like the original Paul.
They're similar. They're not exact. He got kind of that lazy, droopy thing going here.
But then
right?
and he had that done in number 3. You can see those eyes have been done to make them look like number 1.
But they also could do it through latex. See, the thing is, like when you watch movies, you'll see actors and actresses when latex is used. They could do a lot of amazing things with latex.
Okay.
I know it's difficult. It really is. It's hard to get your head around. The only thing I could recommend is I retired the research, the ongoing research, day in and day out stuff. I'm done with that. But my YouTube channel is still up. It's going to stay up as a repository. Take a look at what I've done there because I explain a lot of this stuff. Here's another image. This is the ocular prosthetic. Sally said that what happens with ocular prosthetics because they lay on top of the eyeball, that the top lid protrudes out. And we see this with Billy, protrudes out. Here he is. This is a really weird one with the bear. Pudsey, the bear.
Yeah.
He's got his right eye masked over. That's because Billy can't see. He's blind in his right eye.
But that Pudsey's always had that over the eye.
Right. But aside from Billy promoting children in need, is he giving us a hidden clue about himself? In the book, he tells us that he was in a program and ritually abused starting at the age of 3. That was his earliest memory. And that he was tutored by Aleister Crowley for 10 years. Billy was born in 37. Crowley died in 47. So that's the 10 years. So what is he telling us? So when Billy is playing Paul McCartney, he's represented by the number 9. When he's playing himself, when he's not Billy, he's the number 6. All right. So Pudsey has Pythagorean numerology of 9. So right there, he's aligning himself with the bear for some reason. Why is that? Pudsey has a patch over his right eye. Billy is blind in his right eye. Pudsey is wearing a Sergeant Pepper costume. Is Pudsey, as depicted in the image, a representation of Billy? Is Billy telling us that he was also a child in need as a result of childhood trauma-based programs, again, this is per memoirs, that possibly resulted in the loss of his right eye due to ritual abuse?
Just to play devil's advocate, though, I mean, Pudsey would have had photos with every single celebrity out there. Because they all come on and do the Children in Need shows, like annual thing in England, and they, so every single celebrity would have had a photo with Pudsey, but would it not be the case that it looks as though it's all very symbolic and aligned with Billy and that, but it could just be that, he was just one of thousands of celebrities just have a photo with him.
What we have to do is we have to understand Billy's background.
Yeah.
So we could say, of course, all these different folks have posed with Pudsey the bear and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But we have to understand Billy's background. So in memoirs, when Billy talks about ritual abuse, when he talks about being in a program, when he talks about being tutored and mentored by Aleister Crowley, I also have footage where he's in an interview where he said that he was taught to write his name backwards. This is Crowley's law of reversal. And then when we see Pudsey's eye hidden here, the hidden eye, blind eye, like Billy has a blind eye, in the Sergeant Pepper costume, and the red feet.
Oh, the red shoes.
The red shoes.
Red Shoe Club. One eye is also the one eye as well, in their Freemasonry as well.
When I talk about the Beatles being into the occult,
Yeah.
very esoteric. This is the piece of it that a lot of people, because they don't know about it, when I talk about this, it's like, I don't know about this. I don't know. The only way you're going to know is you have to understand what Billy is about and what the Beatles were all about. And once you start digging into it and you start understanding their connections back into the occult, back into mythology and mysticism, like the cult of Pan. Billy aligns himself with the cult of Pan.
I used to work in a music studio in 2004, 2005. And on one occasion, there was like a memo that got sent around, and it was that Paul McCartney was going to be coming to the building, right? And it said in that memo, it says, if anyone sees him, you have to make sure you call him by his real name. And I remember we all at work, we were all thinking, like, why are you even saying that? You know, like,
Right.
why would you even sending a memo to say that, oh, this person, Paul, has to be called Paul? Like, it just, even that at the time just felt very strange. And I think someone that worked with us, when they saw him, they went, all right, John. Just
Yeah.
because we just thought it was so arrogant that Paul McCartney's asked everyone to make sure that they refer to him as Paul, like, well, Sir Paul,
Yeah.
whatever.
Don't call him Billy.
Yeah, like, but why ask us we wouldn't have known that anyway. But it almost felt slightly arrogant, entitled. I don't know. It's just strange.
I think that they probably are concerned that there are people that, even if they're not like in the inner circle,
Yeah,
know that maybe his name is Billy or his name is William, and somebody
right.
might joke around or whatever, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But if we take a look here, see, here
Hmm.
we have a depiction of Pan,
Yeah.
and look at Billy jumping over a car in the same way that Pan is jumping over this log. And
Mm.
I can't go into this chart now because it'll take us a long time. It's a very interesting chart, but the whole Sergeant Pepper outfits, the multicolored outfits or pied clothing is tied to the Pied Piper. The story of the
Right.
Pied Piper is a variation of the story of the mythology of Pan. If we go to the Help album, we're told to the profane, they're spelling out a semaphore
Hmm.
for the word help. It's not that at all. If we use semaphore, which is visual signaling by the means of flags or lights
Mm.
or their hands, it's NUJV. It's not HELP. No, what they're showing you on the cover of Help is Crowley's ritual symbols. And this comes right from the Thelema website. Osiris slain, Typhon, Isis mourning, Set fighting. And I did a whole bit on this. I explained the whole Help album. Did the Beatles know they were doing this? No, the Beatles didn't know. They were told to pose.
Let's say they did that NUJV, okay, and let's just say that is referencing, so it's like Osiris and Set and all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff, right? Are they doing that as a tip in the hat, as an acknowledgement of these forces, or is
Yes.
it something they're doing to create a kind of a functional sigil, where like a gateway that draws in energy and influences reality in a very specific pre-programmed way? Is it just a tip of the hat to all that?
I think it's both.
Right, okay.
I think it's both. It's like I said, it's very complex
Yeah.
and it's both. And in fact, I went through this and I actually said I can't go into it here. It would be way too
Yeah, yeah,
long.
it's a deep
But
one.
they're actually telling the story of the rise of Horus. That's what they're telling us here. Osiris is slain.
Yeah,
Typhon was also identified with Set. Set is the Egyptian god of destruction.
yeah,
Isis goes into mourning. What happened was Set chopped up, dismembered Osiris. Osiris was Set's brother. Isis puts them back together again. And then Horus is born. And
mm,
then Horus goes on to battle Set. It's the classic battle between the light and the dark. The way I decoded this, and others might decode it a different way, is the Help album is also telling us the story of Horus, the Savior God, that's going to take us into the eon of Horus. Here's another one here. This is crazy.
mm,
One of my listeners pointed this out. So a lot of people look at the Parlophone label and they think that that's the British pound sign,
mm.
but it's not. It's the Leviathan cross. So even the label
Oh, yeah,
is depicting, and it's within a circle, which makes it a sigil.
yeah, yeah.
The original Parlophone label was referred to as the black and gold, which is the color of alchemy.
It also looks a bit like it's made out of rope. You know, when you have like the knot in a hangman
Yeah,
noose. You know.
but it's almost like a snake, John.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole thing with the butcher cover.
You see loads of celebrities, musicians, artists doing certain things, you know, like that, or you know, the covering one eye and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
people say that is definitely them in the club. But isn't it not the case that they could go into a photo shoot and it could be the producer, the photographer, the people behind going, right, I want you to cover one eye now. It might not be them through their own volition choosing those signs to say that they're yet on part of the club. It could just be they're in a room. Hey, can you now just put a hand over one eye? Or can you now do that? But everyone thinks,
Yes.
I don't know what you think about that, but that just
Yeah,
seems.
no, it's exactly what I said here with help. They didn't know that. They just were told to hold your hands out this way, and then the
Yeah,
pictures were taken. It's the same thing with the butcher cover, which is a creepy cover.
disgusting.
Dismembered body parts can represent mind control and or being transformed into a different kind of being, at least partially, to an other than human person or spirit. Now, a listener on my channel said to me the Masonic connection to the impending death of Paul are transparent. He's talking about the butcher cover. He goes, obviously the butcher record cover shows a severed baby's head in Paul's lap. Paul was allegedly decapitated. And there's a reference to time and death. Paul's wearing a wristwatch and he's showing it to us. My source goes on to say he probably wasn't aware of this, but no wonder he was having bad dreams. In memoirs, it tells us he was having nightmares, and they draw it back to the Faustian bargain that he engaged in. And as he was getting closer to his end of life, the nightmares picked up more and more. Now, also, people will say that the Beatles, they didn't want to do this cover. They didn't want to do the butcher cover. And that's not true. I have an actual interview from John Lennon going back into the 1970s where he said, especially him, but the others were on board too, but John in particular wanted to do the cover because he said he was sick and tired of doing these straightforward, boring album covers. And he thought that, this here was because of the shock value. He liked it. The explanation out there that they really didn't want to do this because people don't want to accept that the Beatles would participate in something like this, whether they knew it or not, is not true. They were aware of it. They were on board and they were okay with doing the album cover.
And also, just a quick one, like when the real Paul McCartney died, surely wasn't there not camaraderie from the rest of them to say, look, we don't want to do it anymore. We don't want this imposter. Or are they just so far down? Are they so into it now that there's no backing out?
I don't think there's any backing out, John. I thought that, obviously they had to be very, very upset about Paul not being there anymore. But I think that the premise that they would just walk away, no. The Beatles were too big an operation for anybody to walk away from it. And what I also tell people is that the death of Paul McCartney, the replacement of Paul McCartney, is a subplot. The biggest story about the Beatles is what they were put into play to do to change culture and society. And whether Paul was replaced or not, people have to transcend. They have to get past that whole Paul dying. You have to get past that.
Yeah.
Because whether Paul died or not, the Beatles were in play to social engineer with or without Paul.
Yeah.
So if Paul was still there, Paul was still in the Beatles would still have continued on that trajectory to do what they were missioned to do, what they were constructed and manufactured to do. I'm talking to the audience here because a lot of times people get caught up in the weeds on this thing, and you have to get above the weeds. You got to look at the bigger picture on this thing.
But from their perspective, John Lennon, Harrison, were they not like, oh no, fuck this, like without Paul, like we die together. Well, I'm not doing it anymore. Like from their own perspective.
Well, it wasn't harmony when Billy came on board. In the book, he explains this too, that he said John in particular can be very, very harsh with him. And we could start to see that starting with the White Album, because Sgt. Pepper itself, that album, was really the Billy and George Martin project. That's what I concluded. The rest of the Beatles were there, but their level of participation was not anywhere close to what we had with Billy doing what he was doing. He was deleting tracks that others recorded on. He re-recorded his own guitar parts, bass parts, and stuff like that. So it was really him and George Martin putting that whole record together, because that Sgt. Pepper was very, very important to the psychedelic movement, that whole psychedelic genre of music in that whole era. Very, very important. So it had to be done right. But once we get to the White Album, there's a lot of dissension among the band. And the Beatles themselves talked about this. John had talked about it. George Harrison had talked about it. Ringo Starr walked out of the White Album sessions because he thought that they didn't love him anymore. George Martin actually walked out of the sessions. He just said, I'm out of here, because of the way the sessions were being run, because Billy at that point had taken the reins as the de facto handler, manager of the band. So there was a lot of dissension. And we actually see that as we get into the Let It Be album as well. into I should say, the Get Back sessions, the Peter Jackson depiction of what went on, that was not reality. We have to go back to the original film to really get a feel for what that was all about. George Harrison walked out of the Get Back sessions. He left. And we can also see, even in the Get Back, Peter Jackson's Get Back documentary, I'll give Peter credit. He did leave in scenes where we could see where it was coming apart. There was one scene I remember where they were in the studio. Billy was talking about next steps for the band and keeping the band together. And the other band members were quiet. They didn't say anything. To the contrary, they wanted no part of that. They wanted out. And in fact, Billy said that it had gotten to the point in the band where there was so much head knocking that it was him who decided to break the band up. It wasn't Yoko Ono and John Lennon. Billy decided to pull the plug on the band because it just wasn't working anymore. We never got to Rubber Soul, but that's
all right.
That's okay.
That's fine.
Anybody who wants to know about Rubber Soul, I'll send John some links and you can take a look at it.
Yeah, no, great stuff, mate. Great stuff. And it's just, we're only really scratching the surface of it. I mean, there's so much more and so much more detail that you go into in your presentations and everything else. So
it's 8 years of it, John. It's 8 years of it. And it was, a lot of deep research. And it wasn't just me. I mean, I was connected into a group of maybe a half dozen researchers. It was a loosely knit group, networked together. Very smart, very good researchers. And a lot of it is my research. But like I said, the eye was Sally. That's not mine. She made that discovery. The most important discovery to differentiate Paul and Billy. Stacy's work on his family tree is, like I said, we can't be 100% sure, but is it compelling? It sure is. Sharon Clemens, who was not part of the network at the time, but Sharon and I communicate here and there now since she's been on the show. Really, really good work in her book, A Forbidden Fruit. I recommend everybody read that because that's going to be a version of the story that is not in memoirs. And it's again, very compelling and very good. So there's a lot more to this than what people think. It's not just about the replacement of Paul McCartney. Like I said, subplot, so much more to it.
Yeah, I mean, people can also look at what was her name with the prosthetic leg?
Heather Mills.
Yeah, so if people want to look at Heather Mills, she's on a TV breakfast show, and she says, "I found a box of evidence, and it's not infidelity; it's something way worse than that. It's a betrayal that goes way deeper than infidelity."
Yes.
And what could be more of a betrayal than infidelity, other than pretending to be someone and sleeping with them and building a relationship with them?
I can't. I think I may know what it is. And you have to go back and listen to the interview that Heather did.
Yeah.
Where she was on that British TV show. Listen to what she says. Now, the reason why I'm being very coy about this is because it's very dark. And I don't want to say anything because I could be completely wrong.
Yeah.
But listen to what she said in that interview. Listen very closely to how she says she was treated. I'll give you that much of a hint to the audience. Listen to what she says, how she was treated.
But it is about the replacement, though, no? She's got a box of evidence. Okay, you don't think it is? Oh, right. Okay.
No. I think it was played up that way, but I don't think it has anything to do with a box of evidence that he's not Paul McCartney. She's not the only one that would have a box of evidence on that. You know what I'm saying? Ringo has that box. George had that box. John had that box. Yoko has that box. So Pete Best has that box.
Yeah, but she could have just stumbled on it herself.
No, she knew he wasn't Paul McCartney.
Really?
Yeah. In fact, this is how we know, folks. Okay. I have a clip on my channel where he's at the premiere for the Concert of George as a tribute to George Harrison. Billy is there. Heather is right behind him in a yellow dress.
Yeah.
And I think she looked pregnant at the time with Beatrice.
Yeah.
And Olivia Harrison was there with George's son, Donnie.
Hey, Billy.
Hello, Billy.
Yeah.
Heather is right there. Linda knew he wasn't Paul McCartney. Heather knew he wasn't Paul McCartney. Nancy knows he's not Paul McCartney. His current wife is the niece of Barbara Walters. Okay, so what I'm saying is it's one big club and we're not in it.
Thank you to my incredible guest here, Mike Williams. We only want to do like an hour and a half. We've done 3 hours. Time's flown with that, and we probably could have done another 7 hours as well. Still not even got close to.
Just tip of the iceberg.
Absolute tip of the iceberg. But this is what it's about. I'm trying to bring on incredible researchers and thought leaders like Mike onto the show, and give it up for him, and big up to Mike. And Mike, just plug all your stuff that you want to plug, just so I can get it in there.
Just go to my website, folks. I have a hub website, Sage of Quay, SAGEOFQUAY.com, and all of my links are there. Like I said, I wrapped up the research on the Beatles, the ongoing day-to-day stuff, but my Paul is Dead channel is up as a repository, and also I'm a musician. My music links are all there as well, and yeah, poke around, see if there's anything there that interests you.